China is considered a global superpower, a nation destined to overtake the United States as the most powerful nation on the planet, fielding a population of over 1.4 billion and an $18 trillion GDP. It makes one wonder, what is the future of China? This video will discuss China's projected trajectory for the future, whether they will continue to grow, stagnate, or potentially decline, especially in relation to America. In order to discuss how China operates today, we must first look at how China reaches this point. We are briefly going to go over China's history, starting in the Opium Wars against Britain. The exact specifics of this conflict are a story for a different video, but the crux of it was the Victorian-era Britain asserting itself as the global hegemon and demanding trade concessions against China, ruled then by the Qing dynasty. This was alongside Britain demanding a treaty port in China that they could freely access for trade in goods such as opium. This treaty port was leased to Britain for 150 years as part of the peace deal in the Opium Wars. This place is known as Hong Kong. Following this punitive war that damaged not only the strength of China as a global power, but its perceived reputation. This period, lasting until 1949, is commonly known in China as the Century of Humiliation, as China was routinely faced with instability, revolts, famines, and imperial invasions by the European powers and Japan. This culminated in a destruction of a unified China in 1911 up until 1949. This is known as the Warlord Era, as China was split into several warring factions, vying for control of China. This period ended when two factions, the larger nationalist Chinese faction, led by Chiang Kai-shek, formed an alliance with the smaller communist Chinese faction, led by Mao Zedong. This alliance formed due to the Japanese invasion of China in 1937, till the Japanese surrendered in 1945. This conflict resulted in the deaths of over 20 million people and a total destruction of Chinese cities, such as Beijing, Shanghai, and Nanking. Countless atrocities being committed by Japan in this conflict. When this war ended, the communist Chinese resumed their battle with the nationalist Chinese and eventually won the Civil War in 1949, with Chiang Kai-shek and his regime fleeing to the island of Taiwan for security. China now became the People's Republic of China, headed by Mao Zedong, a one-party communist nation. China, in this period, was deeply impoverished and agrarian, with the average person having approximately $90 to their name in 1960, and 80% of the population was rural. What began in China was a variety of 5-year plans to industrialize the nation, akin to other state-controlled economies like what the Soviet Union had done under Stalin and Vladimir Lenin, in which this economic formula was to turn a primarily farmer-based society into a modern industrialized urban economy. To reach this state, millions perished in famines, failure to meet extreme agricultural quotas, and state repression of civil rights such as religion, opposition, and art. Upon the death of Mao Zedong in 1976, China began to reform the state-controlled authoritarian system under the reformer Deng Xiaoping. He was purged from the Chinese government for his opposition to Mao Zedong's doctrinaire policies. Twice, Deng Xiaoping began a process of liberalizing the economy and allowing limited and controlled corporations to set up in China. This was known by the advisor to Deng Xiaoping, Chen Yun, as the birdcage economy. As in his words, the cage is the plan, and it may be large or small, but within that cage, the bird is free to fly as he wishes. This metaphor can be perfectly shown. The city of Shenzhen forms the blueprint of the entire Chinese economy. Many trade officials, such as future leader of China, Jiang Zemin, alongside the father of the current premier, Xi Jinping, Xi Zhangshan, took inspiration for this economic policy of various Western free trade private capital zones, such as the Free Trade Zone outside Shannon Airport in Clare, Ireland. Shenzhen was then established as a special economic zone, where the free market could operate with state oversight. This is humorously known as communism with Chinese characteristics. Between 1981 and 1984, Shenzhen's economy grew by 59% alone, and by 2006, accounted for 8% of the entire Chinese economy. What was once a city of 300,000 people that was entirely reliant on the commerce from Hong Kong is now home to over 20 million people and has a $1 trillion economy larger than Hong Kong itself. Quickly, these special economic zones spread throughout the southern Guangdong province in China, eventually culminating into the basis for the entire national economy due to their immediate success. The growth of the Chinese economy in 2007 alone was larger than the 1979 economy. These policies created in Shenzhen that have now become the basis for the Chinese economy for close to 40 years have lifted over 400 million people out of poverty. And China is now the second largest economy in the world and has a GDP per capita of nearly $14,000 per person. China has become a global export hub, exporting more goods than the United States, undeniable tech industry and financial giant on the world stage. The main question for China now is, what direction is there now? As China now faces a much greater political and economic issues than during the reformist periods of Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin. For example, let's start with exports and trade. Exports make up over 40% of China's current economic growth and nearly 20% of their entire economy. The Chinese economy is incentivized to produce more products than what they need, as certain manufacturing is subsidized by the government, meaning they have no punishment for selling products at a loss while increasing sales both internationally and domestically. The Chinese public, compared to other similarly wealthy countries, does not consume or purchase as much domestic goods. This is called public consumption, and means it is significantly harder for the Chinese government to engage the public in commercial activities, especially in retirement compared to other nations. Due to the low consumption rate in China, the Chinese economy produces more and more goods that are not being bought by their own population, meaning they are reliant on other countries buying said products. Now, what happens if other countries no longer buy their products, or raise the cost of them, making people not want to purchase the Chinese products? This can be shown by the increasing Chinese hostility from nations such as the United States under Trump, where trade tariffs on Chinese products become accepted and normalized. For instance, in Trump's first term, the tariff on Chinese steel remained under Biden, and now that Trump has returned, tariffs on China have increased. This means less Chinese products are going to be bought. Similar trends are happening in the European Union and closer nations such as Japan and South Korea, that have become increasingly wary to the behavior of the Chinese government. The second major issue is productivity. A major proponent of China's rapid economic growth is with the investment of infrastructure projects to boost the productivity of their population. This means more goods, more services, and a wealthier state. However, since the COVID-19 pandemic, the ratio of productivity tied to infrastructure projects has dropped, meaning the Chinese government is putting in a far higher rate of investment for far lower output. This is not helped by the unexpected slowing of the Chinese economy over 2025 from 5% to 4%. So, when the economy is slowing down, it becomes harder to make larger and larger investments with less payoff. There is a hard ceiling that reality must adhere to, and the Chinese government will sooner rather than later. A third major issue for China that they are not alone with will be demographics. China has a declining population. That is a fact backed up by their census. The ghost of Deng Xiaoping's one-child policy remains, in which couples were mandated to have at most one child. This still ripples across China, and particularly rural communities. Even though the policy was exempt for certain communities and ethnic minorities such as Tibetans and Mongolians, it dramatically reduced the birth rate in China, especially in rural regions where the infanticide of daughters skyrocketed. This has left an issue in China where there are significantly and noticeably more men than women. Close to half of China was granted exemptions to the one-child policy, when it was revoked in favor of the two-child policy in 2015. However, it was too late. Deng Xiaoping instituted this policy to curb population growth and stabilize the Chinese economy. It has proven to be far too efficient at curbing growth. Economic development of nations and urbanization typically results in lower birth rates, regardless of government policy. Having a state-enforced birth control dramatically cuts down population growth at a far higher rate than other economically similar nations. Because of this, China has one of the lowest birth rates in the world, rivaling South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan. However, what makes this issue far worse for China is that their retirement age is at 55 for men compared to other similar nations that have it hovering in the 60s range. Alongside this, Chinese workers have far lower pensions and are far less likely to spend that money that they have on consumption. This is especially noticeable in similarly developed Asian nations such as South Korea and Japan. So, when a Chinese person retires, they have less money, and they keep it to themselves, so that essentially it's income that disappears out of the Chinese economy. Their population is poorer, getting out of the workforce early, and not helping the economy when they leave. This is a far greater issue as time progresses. It is estimated by 2050, nearly a quarter of China's population will be elderly and require care, with pensions, expected care, and health services required to maintain an increasingly elderly population.
Adding on to this, youth unemployment has skyrocketed in China,
with an unemployment rate above 20% as of several years ago. This is because the Chinese government has stopped publishing data on the youth unemployment rate. One wonders why. If the trend continues, you have an issue where there are more pensioners than ever before that require more care than ever.
a smaller and smaller workforce.
How can a nation grow when there are more elderly that aren't providing to the economy compared to other nations, and the average worker is poorer, meaning they can't be taxed as much compared to Japan or South Korea? This is a far larger question than this video, as it does not seem there is any real solution to the birth rate crisis experienced in developed nations outside of immigration, which has proven to be a temporal solution, given regardless of background, second-generation families will have the same birth rates as native populations. It is not a solution, it is a band-aid. There are serious crises, and that is not including other issues such as semiconductors, Taiwan, Xi Jinping's authoritarianism, and the housing crisis within China. But those topics are outside of the scope of this video, and what we are here to discuss is the previously outlined issues within the Chinese economy, demographics, and geopolitical future. Firstly, how does China address Trump, tariffs, and export economics? Donald Trump is a hard character for Xi to court, given Trump's increasingly erratic and aggressive foreign policy that has attacked China with tariffs, alongside damaging China's allies such as Venezuela and Iran. Venezuela, Iran, and Russia are nations that China is reliant on for oil. However, now that Trump has overthrown Nicolas Maduro, the Venezuelan president, Venezuela is now an American-aligned state that is refusing to export oil to China. When it comes to Iran, there is deep uncertainty given Trump's unpredictability, let alone his ability to retain influence and mental stability for the remainder of his term. With Russia's invasion of Ukraine deeply destabilizing Russia and reducing its ability to influence global affairs, it is abundantly clear that at the moment, China is taking a far more conciliatory approach to international relations than its allies and Trump himself. So, we'll have to see where diplomacy regarding tariff increases, tariff decreases, and China's ability to remain a diplomatically approachable nation compared to Russia and the United States. This can be noted by the increasing membership of the BRICS alliance. This is the economic alliance between the growing and influential economies of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. One of the main factors that has allowed China to retain diplomatic prestige is its stability, consistency, and their export economy.
Since China exports more than it needs to produce,
makes other countries inherently reliant on them, meaning many nations will have to consume their produce out of necessity to engage with China on diplomatic terms. Tying into this fact, China's investment in
electric cars and renewable energy more broadly.
Due to China's reliance on importing oil from nations in the Persian Gulf, Venezuela, and Russia, nations that are prone to instability or disruption, China has invested heavily into the creation of renewable energy, creating energy independence. China exports the majority of solar panels now. As of 2026, over 50% of solar panels are made in China. Over 45% of electric batteries are made in China. The prevalence of BYD and other electric car companies means that China equates to over a third of the electric car market alone, given the expectation of the European Union and other developed nations to move towards a net zero carbon emission economy, and mounting pressure to utilize electric vehicles and devices instead of fossil fuels. It is hard to see how these economies become less reliant on China when, to function as a nation, they are required to purchase more Chinese products. This would have the obvious impact of intertwining Chinese influence with these nations and strengthening the Chinese economy through foreign investment and purchasing. This is especially prescient considering China invests quite heavily into developing nations and connecting their economies with China's. This can be shown through initiatives such as the Belt and Road and subsidiary plans such as the Beijing Action Plan, BRICS New Development Bank, and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. It could also be described that China's foreign policy strategy is a crucial aspect to maintaining their economic prowess. Think of it like a bear hug strategy. In order to prop up the state economic model, continual state subsidies and infrastructure projects is to make the global economy more reliant on China. When the growth of developed countries continue to slow, in an ironic sense, it makes China far better positioned as their growth is slowing, although it is not expected to decline or stagnate as quickly as other developed nations. What this means is that while other nations decline or stagnate, they are required to maintain economic dependence on China, equating to retaining influence, investment, and growth for China. Ultimately, it is a short-term strategy that is dependent on China continuing to grow. A glaring issue with the strategy is what if China does not grow? After all, the GDP growth of China in the fourth quarter of 2025 was unexpectedly lower than projections expected. What if this trend continues and the Chinese economy proves to be far less stable or growing than expected? It could be a house of cards in which foreign investment declines and China begins to stagnate, akin to neighboring states. The uncertainty may be quite disastrous for the status quo, given if China is no longer able to subsidize its surplus inventory, many nations may not be able to purchase their electronics, textiles, electric batteries, and other crucial products. Compounding this, many nations have expectations as part of the Belt and Road Initiative of Chinese investment and Chinese economic dependence. If Chinese presence recedes, there may be serious resource and economic shortfalls in many developing nations that China has a large presence with. In conclusion, what is going to happen to China? Unless something unforeseen happens soon, which given our world is more likely than not, China is inevitably heading towards an economy that is going to slow in growth and demographically. It has a variety of tools such as energy independence, economic exports, and global cooperation as tools to retain economic stability and growth. However, at the same time, China is dependent on global stability to retain its influence, yet needs America to destabilize in order to surpass them. As with current economic and demographic trends, America will maintain its economic superiority and has far more stable demographics than China. So, for China to overtake America as the dominant global superpower, America needs to decline as a power, but not to the extent that it damages China and the allies it is dependent upon for resources. For if America has a dramatic decline in influence, wealth, and power, the Chinese economy would also retain a significant decline alongside the economies that are dependent on China and America. It is uncertain if these strategies that are proposed by the Chinese government can actually sustain long-term stability, as frankly, a lot of these techniques seem to retain short-term gain and prone to falling into the same demographic and economic stagnation that similar economies face. Couple that with the added risk of massive state infrastructure and subsidization projects to propagate productivity, incurring massive debt by nature. The world is inherently unstable, and the rapid changes in global affairs on a seemingly weekly basis seems uncontrollable and dramatic. At the same time, change can only come about through decisions, and for a world that China has known, of humiliation, famine, and destruction, that is being so rapidly shifted into a global power, in the words of the man that ushered in this era, Deng Xiaoping, cross the river by feeling for stones under one's feet.